October of 2021, sitting in the back of a plane, staring out of the window, I was feeling anxious. My life was over. You see, my choices had led me here, to the heart of our planet. I left my home, my friends, and everything I knew to get here. But even I wouldn't have imagined the bizarre sequence of events that took place in the next 4 years. How this new beginning was the best thing that ever happened to me. I didn't know how much I needed to be forgotten. Most of us are just a collection of other people's expectations. We do things we haven't really thought about just because the people around us expect them. But when you land in a place where no one knows your name, the mask finally slips. You're left with nothing but yourself and your memories. And that's when you finally start to see which parts of your life were actually yours. It's a perspective most men are too afraid to seek, but for a boy who had become a legend of violence, it was the only way to finally become a man. Thorfinn was a boy who spent 10 years as a storm of iron and blood. He was a weapon, a name whispered in fear across battlefields, fueled by a single burning purpose: revenge. But when that purpose was stripped away, he was sold into labor, becoming a slave. He ended up on a remote farm, clearing a forest that seemed to have no end. For the first time in his life, he didn't have a weapon, a title, or a purpose. Thorfinn's world had stopped moving, yet in that stillness there was one thing moving. In that quiet place there was one thing screaming. In that peace there was one thing roaring: the shadows of his past. There was nowhere for Thorfinn to run. He had to look deep within himself and confront his sins, all the people he had killed, the families he had robbed, and the time he had stolen. This was his reality. After coming to terms with everything, Thorfinn had become an empty shell. But there was a beauty to his new life that I believe simple words are not enough to describe. And the blisters on his hands and the rhythm of the axe, Thorfinn had finally heard his own heart beat for the first time. He started to think, move, and act, not as a child manipulated by the land of war, but as a man deciding to move forward, carrying the weight of his sins on his shoulders and the courage to face the cruel world he found himself in with kindness. He showed us that being forgotten is often the only way to heal a soul that was built for others. But for some, the choice to vanish isn't a healing process. It's a desperate, dark gamble. There was once a young man raised by people who weren't his family. Abused, traumatized, and scarred by them, he decides to run away. But unfortunately for him, this was the 1950s, and the land of war was his only escape. Under the rain of bullets, terrified, injured, and desperate for an exit, he stares at the dead body laying beside him. And he saw an opportunity. He swapped the dog tags, buried his own identity in a shallow grave, and walked away wearing a dead man's name. The young man spent the next 20 years making something out of himself. He moved to the city, put on a suit, and got himself into the business of advertising. Eventually, he became the king of the industry. He had the house, the family, the prestige, but there was a rot at the center of it. He had successfully made the world forget the broken little boy he used to be, but he had replaced him with a performance. Even in this new perfect life of his, he would yearn for another exit, staring at the horizon, waiting for the moment he could shed his new name just as easily as he did his old one. The need to be forgotten, you see, is a double-edged sword. If you disappear to find yourself, you find peace. But if you disappear just to hide, you realize that no matter how far you run, you are the one person you cannot leave behind. Even if you change your name, it will only be another cage. But history gave us one man who was offered the entire world, yet he chose to give it back. Cincinnatus was the voice of Rome. He was a consul, the highest office in the most powerful city on earth. He had spent his life in the marble halls of the Senate, commanding legions and making decisions that shifted the borders of our world. He was a man whose name was etched into the very foundations of the Republic. But then, he walked away. He didn't just retire, he vanished. He left the politics, the silk ropes, and the constant noise of a city that demanded his attention to move to a small 4-acre plot of land across the Tiber River. He traded the weight of a sword for the weight of a wooden plow, and he had successfully become a ghost in his own country. Until the day dust rose on the horizon. Rome was facing total annihilation. An entire army had been trapped in the mountains, and the city was paralyzed by fear. The leaders of the Senate knew there was only one man with the mind to save them, but they had to find him first. They crossed the river, found him in the middle of a field, just a regular old farmer taking care of his land. But they knew he was a titan covered in dirt. They told him the Republic was dying, and they draped the purple toga of a dictator over his sweat-stained shoulders. In that moment, he was no longer a ghost, he was a ruler of men. He had the absolute power over every life in Rome. He went to war, and in just 15 days, he broke the enemy. He marched back into the city to the deafening roars of thousands of people screaming his name. He was the absolute peak of human glory, and he could have stayed on that throne until the day he died. But instead, on the 16th day, he did one thing no one expected. He resigned. He handed back the power, turned his back on the cheering crowds, and walked out of the city gates alone. He went back to the river, back to his 4 acres, and picked up the plow exactly where he had left it 16 days earlier. He understood a truth that most men spend their whole lives trying to ignore. He didn't want the crown because the crown meant he belonged to the people. He wanted the plow because the plow meant he belonged to himself. Thorfinn found himself in the dirt. Dawn tried to find himself in a stolen name. Cincinnatus found himself by walking away from a throne. They all realized that you cannot truly choose your path until you have stood in a place where no one is pushing you. When you are forgotten, you're finally free to analyze your experiences without the weight of outside pressure. You get to decide what you believe in. You might choose to go back to exactly where you were, but this time, you aren't going back because you have to, you are going back because you want to. The silent need to be forgotten is actually a need to be found. By stripping away who the world wants you to be, you finally give yourself the chance to choose who you actually are. And until next time, stay safe.